I knew the exact moment the tectonic plates of our company shifted. It was during a quarterly review, right after Kelsey used the word disruptive 3 times in a single sentence without blinking. That perfectly tailored blazer-wearing graduate of some expensive business program came marching into our logistics hub, like she had just personally invented the concept of moving freight. She had not inherited a corner office from the man who used to call me the anchor of this entire operation. I am 54 years old. My name is Julian Vance. For 21 years, I have been the quiet pulse of this company. I joined when our tracking system consisted of a whiteboard, a landline phone, and a sheer refusal to lose a shipment. I was there before the expansions, before the massive distribution centers, and long before anyone on the board had ever heard of Kelsey. Elias, the man who built this empire from a single leased delivery truck, used to tell me that structure is the only thing that survives a storm. I made sure every contract, every vendor agreement, and every legal charter had an undeniable paper trail. Over the years, I became the director of strategic operations. To the outside world, it sounded like a generic corporate title. Internally, I was the man you called when a union dispute threatened to halt operations, when the compliance team found a discrepancy, or when the legal department lost track of our oldest foundational documents. I kept the massive machine running smoothly without ever demanding the spotlight. Then Elias fell ill. He started slipping away about 2 years ago. It began with forgotten details, missed board meetings, and long, heavy silences. He still possessed sharp moments, but the executive board grew anxious, and an anxious board tends to make impulsive decisions, like handing the reins over to Kelsey, Elias's inexperienced niece. From the very first day Kelsey stepped into the executive suite, with her designer shoes and unearned confidence, I knew a target was painted on my back. She gave a speech about trimming the fat and modernizing our legacy infrastructure, carefully avoiding any eye contact with me. Her eyes were usually fixed on her tablet, browsing through presentations that promised to revolutionize the industry overnight. I began to notice the subtle changes. My access to certain administrative servers became restricted. Junior managers I had personally trained were suddenly bypassing my desk and reporting directly to her. I even overheard her telling the human resources director that I carried too much analog energy for a digital future. But being underestimated is a strange kind of gift. It provides you with quiet time. The kind of time where you can review ancient contracts, pull up archived documents no one has touched since 2012, and remember the exact weight of every promise ever made. Elias and I had a mutual understanding. He trusted me to protect the bedrock of the company. Buried deep within that bedrock were extremely specific, legally binding clauses with sharp teeth. I did not fight the gradual shift in power, I simply observed. I watched Kelsey replace our veteran logistics coordinator with a friend from her university who thought supply chain management meant ordering office supplies online. I watched her attempt to overhaul our routing software, resulting in a 3-day delay for our largest client. However, behind the scenes, I quietly renewed my notary credentials. I retrieved a highly confidential document signed by Elias over a decade ago. I began archiving every single email communication into a secure server. I knew the final confrontation would happen abruptly. Kelsey did not possess the courage for a fair fight in broad daylight. She preferred to strike when the building was empty, and while I waited for her inevitable move, I made absolutely sure that every single document she deemed irrelevant was perfectly in order. I was not plotting a malicious revenge. I was simply preserving the structure of the company. Kelsey never learned the most important lesson of business. The person who understands the foundation holds the power to dismantle the entire house. And I was holding a sledgehammer. The blow came at 6:45 in the morning on a Thursday. Only a coward schedules a meeting before the sun is fully risen and the loading docks are still quiet. I was parking my car when the notification appeared on my phone. An urgent meeting request in the main conference room. No agenda, no preparation materials, just a demand for my immediate presence. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, Kelsey was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. She was sipping an iced coffee, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Beside her sat the director of human resources, looking deeply uncomfortable. Kelsey did not waste any time with pleasantries. "Julian," she began, her tone dripping with false sympathy, "we have been evaluating our operational efficiencies, and after several difficult conversations, we have decided to phase out your position as part of our restructuring initiative." She actually smiled when she said it. I did not blink. I did not show an ounce of shock or anger. I simply stared at her, absorbing the audacity of a 28-year-old terminating a 21-year veteran before breakfast. "We truly value your historical contributions," she added, "but we need a more dynamic approach moving forward. Consider this your final lesson in corporate evolution." I remained completely silent. I did not argue, and I did not ask for a severance package. I simply nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked out of the room. The long walk down the empty corridor felt surreal. My hands were perfectly steady. I drove directly to my bank, walked inside, and deposited my final paycheck. That specific timestamp was the first domino to fall. Next, I drove to a notary public I had trusted for years. The document I presented was already printed and prepared. It required only the official seal. The notary read the first paragraph, raised an eyebrow, and stamped the paper without asking a single question. I then handed the envelope to a specialized legal courier. I instructed him that the package must be delivered directly into the hands of our general counsel, Nadine. No assistants, no receptionists, only Nadine. I sat in my car outside the corporate headquarters and watched the courier walk into the lobby. Kelsey had no idea that she had just triggered the collapse of her own brief reign. The letter now moving across the city contained much more than standard severance demands. It was a formal notification referencing a specific section of a highly restricted operational agreement, a safeguard established over a decade ago. It stated that if my employment was terminated without unanimous board approval and strict adherence to specific severance protocols, operational oversight of the entire company would automatically revert to Elias's trust within 48 hours. Kelsey had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. Meanwhile, back at the corporate office, Kelsey was celebrating her victory. She posted an animated graphic on our internal communications platform featuring a broom sweeping away dust. The caption read, "Clearing out the old, making room for true disruption." Several of her new hires reacted with applause emojis. I knew this because a few loyal colleagues forwarded me screenshots. Loyalty does not disappear the moment your corporate email account is deactivated. From her newly renovated corner office, Kelsey paced like a conquering hero. She genuinely believed she had removed the final obstacle to her complete control. She even ordered an expensive catered lunch for her inner circle, toasting to a new era of streamlined efficiency. She was completely oblivious to the legal time bomb ticking quietly in the background. I did not celebrate. I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and drafted a precise timeline on a yellow notepad. I noted the exact minute of my termination, 6:45 in the morning. I logged the time the notary stamped my document. I tracked the courier's progress block by block. By 12 noon, I received confirmation that the package had been signed for by Nadine. I had an airtight paper trail, physical receipts, and a recorded message left with my personal attorney. That evening, Nadine sent a brief email to my personal address. She simply asked me to confirm if I had initiated the legal action outlined in the foundational documents. I replied immediately, confirming that the document had been executed and delivered as required. Then, I closed my laptop and waited for the panic to begin. The collapse of a corporate hierarchy does not happen with a loud explosion. It begins with quiet whispers and closed-door meetings. By Friday morning, 24 hours after my termination, Kelsey had already fired 3 more senior managers. Our director of fleet operations, our payroll specialist, and the woman who built our training program from scratch were all escorted out. In their places, Kelsey installed individuals whose only qualifications were personal connections and a shared vocabulary of meaningless business jargon. Her university roommate was named the new head of strategic innovation, despite having zero experience in the logistics industry. The internal communications platform became a stream of motivational quotes, masking a growing sense of dread among the remaining veteran staff. I sat in my home office, drinking black coffee and watching the digital leaks pour in. A junior analyst sent me a revised budget projection. Kelsey had completely altered my financial models, replacing them with wildly optimistic figures that ignored basic operational costs. She had essentially rewritten our financial reality to impress the board. Late Friday afternoon, my access to the company's human resources portal flickered back to life for just a few minutes. It was enough time for me to witness an attempt to backdate my official termination notice. They were trying to change the timeline to avoid the 48-hour reversion trigger. They were amateurs attempting to rewrite history, but they forgot that the historian held all the original receipts. My stamped check deposit and the courier's signed delivery confirmation were already logged. I sent the evidence to my attorney, who told me to simply let them fail. By the weekend, the rumors were impossible to contain. Employees from the legal and accounting departments suddenly called in sick, avoiding any involvement in the impending disaster. An anonymous email arrived in my inbox containing a screenshot of Kelsey bragging that my job could be easily replaced by automated software. I saved the image in a folder labeled Ignition Files. The countdown was entering its final phase. Kelsey spent her weekend drafting a massive rebranding campaign, completely unaware that the ground beneath her had already vanished. The Monday morning board meeting was intended to be a victory lap. Kelsey stood at the head of the conference table, wearing a crisp white suit, ready to present her vision for a modernized supply chain. The board members sat politely, expecting a routine presentation. Nadine, however, did not look polite. She sat rigidly, clutching a thick manila folder as if it were a weapon. Kelsey began her speech, speaking passionately about eliminating institutional drag and embracing a lean, agile framework. She promised record profits and unprecedented growth. The board listened quietly, their faces unreadable. Finally, Nadine raised her hand, interrupting the presentation. She announced that a legally binding document had been delivered on Thursday, triggering a mandatory review of the executive transition. Kelsey scoffed, dismissing the interruption. She claimed that all legacy documents had been nullified during the previous audit. She insisted that my departure was a closed case. Nadine's voice remained cold and steady as she explained that the governing charter had not been nullified. She revealed the document I had sent, clearly stating the activation of the reversion clause due to improper termination procedures. The room descended into absolute silence. The board members exchanged nervous glances, realizing the severity of the situation. Kelsey's confident smile faltered as the reality of the legal trap began to dawn on her. She had fired the one person who held the power to dissolve her entire executive standing, and there were less than 10 hours remaining before the transition of power became absolute. Kelsey tried to maintain her composure, but her voice cracked when she demanded to see the physical documents. Nadine obliged without hesitation, sliding the notarized papers across the polished mahogany table. Kelsey read the clause, her eyes scanning the precise legal terminology that Elias and I had drafted over 12 years ago. The words were undeniable and absolute. A direct violation of the Legacy Safeguard Clause meant immediate forfeiture of executive authority. The board members, who had previously nodded along to her modern strategies, now stared at her with a potent mix of shock and betrayal. They realized that her impulsive decision to terminate my employment without consulting them had jeopardized their entire financial investment. Nadine explained that the 48-hour window was rapidly closing. The board had to produce an updated version of the charter or a written override from Elias himself. Kelsey panicked, the reality of the situation finally piercing her inflated ego. She grabbed her phone, insisting she could drive to the medical facility and get her uncle to sign a waiver immediately. However, Nadine gently reminded her that Elias was under strict medical supervision and that I, Julian Vance, was the only non-family individual legally authorized to access his trust matters or authorized legal contact. Kelsey dropped her phone, the device clattering loudly against the table. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The very man she had mocked as an obsolete analog relic was the absolute gatekeeper to her uncle's massive empire. The board called a temporary recess, leaving Kelsey alone in the conference room to contemplate the terrifying wreckage of her brief tenure. I spent Tuesday morning reviewing global logistics reports in my living room, deliberately ignoring the dozen frantic voicemails from Kelsey. Her messages transformed rapidly from arrogant dismissals to desperate pleas for a private meeting. She offered me a highly paid consultant position. She promised to reinstate my original salary with a substantial bonus. She even suggested we could co-manage the strategic transition to ensure stability. I did not return a single call. I was not interested in negotiations, apologies, or compromises. I was solely interested in watching the 48-hour timer expire completely. The internal communication platform was now in complete disarray. The new executive hires were terrified, and the veteran staff were quietly preparing for my inevitable return. The news of the activated reversion clause had leaked to the industry press, causing a minor panic among our largest international clients. By Tuesday afternoon, the executive board realized they were entirely out of options. They could not contact Elias without my explicit permission, and they could not legally nullify the foundational charter. They convened an emergency meeting, and Nadine laid out the final terms. The 48 hours had officially passed without a valid challenge. The operational oversight of the company was legally transferred to the successor designated in Elias's private trust. Kelsey, pacing desperately at the back of the room, demanded to know the identity of the designated successor. Nadine produced a sealed manila envelope, the only existing physical copy of the trust directive. She opened it slowly. Allowing the immense tension in the room to build, she read the name aloud with absolute clarity. Julian Vance Kelsey stumbled backward, refusing to believe the words echoing in the silent room. She accused Nadine of forging the document. She threatened to sue the entire executive board for negligence. But the signatures were authentic. The notarization was verified, and the legal framework was completely ironclad. I had not merely orchestrated a return to my previous operational position. I had been legally handed the entire logistics company. Elias had always known that his niece was entirely unequipped to manage the complex empire he had meticulously built. He had entrusted me with the ultimate legal failsafe, a mechanism specifically designed to protect the company from reckless nepotism. Kelsey's arrogant, poorly termination of my employment was the exact catalyst required to activate that fail-safe. The next morning, I drove to the corporate headquarters with a calm sense of purpose. I parked in my usual spot, walked past the bewildered security guards, and entered the massive main lobby. The atmosphere was completely silent. Employees watched me with a complex mixture of awe and immense relief as I walked toward the executive suite. Kelsey was waiting in the hallway, looking exhausted, defeated, and remarkably small. Her expensive designer suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant smirk was entirely gone from her face. She tried to block my path, demanding an explanation for what she perceived as a massive betrayal. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer an apology. I simply handed her a printed copy of the formal transition document, outlining the immediate termination of her role as Chief Executive Officer. I looked her directly in the eye and spoke the first words I had said to her since the dark morning she fired me. I told her that she had fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of this business. Logistics is not about disruptive concepts, flashy presentations, or modernizing for the sake of appearances. It is about understanding the foundation, respecting the intricate process, and ensuring that every single detail is meticulously accounted for. I advised her to consider this a genuine, highly expensive lesson in corporate management. She took the document with trembling hands and walked away without uttering a single word. I entered the corner office, the one Elias had built from nothing, and sat down at the heavy oak desk. I opened my laptop, reviewed the morning freight reports, and began the quiet, necessary work of repairing the damage she had caused. The brief storm had passed, and the structure remained standing. The transition of power was never going to be entirely smooth. Kelsey's sudden departure left a massive vacuum of competence that I needed to fill immediately. Her university friends and inexperienced hires were still occupying senior positions, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in leadership. I spent my first official day as the interim chief executive officer conducting a systematic review of every single decision Kelsey had made during her short tenure. It was worse than I had anticipated. She had approved a multi-million-dollar contract with a new, unproven transportation vendor, completely bypassing our standard risk assessment protocols. She had also authorized a massive reduction in warehouse staff, prioritizing short-term financial gains over long-term operational stability. I immediately summoned the remaining executive board members to the main conference room. The atmosphere was completely different from the previous week. They were no longer indulging a young visionary. They were looking to me to salvage their investments. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, holding a thick stack of printed reports. I did not raise my voice, but I did not mince words. I informed them that Kelsey's reckless decisions had cost the company over $400,000 in immediate operational losses, and if left unchecked, her new vendor contracts would result in millions of dollars in future liabilities. The board members who had quietly allowed her to implement these changes now looked deeply ashamed. They realized that their passive complicity had nearly destroyed the company they were supposed to protect. I laid out a comprehensive recovery plan. First, we would immediately terminate the contracts with Kelsey's unproven vendors, utilizing standard escape clauses that she had failed to remove. Second, we would reinstate the warehouse staff she had laid off, ensuring that our logistics network could actually handle the upcoming holiday volume. Third, I demanded a complete audit of the Human Resources Department, specifically targeting the director who had actively collaborated with Kelsey to backdate my termination notice. The board agreed to every single demand without a moment of hesitation. They understood that I was the only person capable of untangling the massive mess she had created. The balance of power had firmly shifted, and I was now holding all the leverage. The Human Resources Director, a man named Sterling, was the first casualty of my new administration. I called him into my office on Wednesday afternoon. He sat nervously in the chair opposite my desk, his eyes darting around the room. I placed a printed copy of the manipulated termination notice on my desk alongside the notarized proof of my original dismissal. I did not ask for an explanation. I simply told him that falsifying corporate documents was a severe violation of our ethical guidelines and a potential legal liability. I offered him a choice. He could resign immediately with a standard severance package, or he could face a formal investigation that would likely result in his termination for cause. He chose the resignation, signing the paperwork with trembling hands before quietly leaving the building. Next, I turned my attention to Kelsey's inner circle. The young men and women she had hired to inject disruptive energy into the company were completely out of their depth. Her former university roommate, who had been appointed head of strategic innovation, had spent his entire time developing a mobile application that none of our clients actually wanted or needed. I scheduled individual performance reviews for each of her new hires. I did not fire them maliciously. I simply presented them with the harsh reality of the logistics industry. I showed them the complex routing schedules, the stringent compliance regulations, and the demanding vendor contracts. I explained that enthusiasm and buzzwords do not move freight across the country. Within 48 hours, every single one of Kelsey's friends had voluntarily submitted their resignations, realizing they were entirely unqualified for the jobs they had been given. The news of my swift and decisive actions rippled through the company. The veteran employees, the men and women who actually kept the trucks running and the warehouses operating, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that had permeated the building under Kelsey's leadership began to dissipate. I made a point to walk the warehouse floors, speaking directly with the foremen and the drivers. I did not offer them motivational speeches or false promises. I simply assured them that the foundation of the company was secure and that their hard work would be respected and properly compensated. The quiet, steady rhythm of the logistics hub slowly returned to normal. However, the legal battles were far from over. Kelsey, despite signing the formal transition document, was not willing to disappear quietly. She retained a highly expensive corporate attorney and filed a formal grievance with the board of directors. She alleged that I had manipulated a senile founder and executed a hostile takeover using an outdated, legally questionable clause. She demanded millions of dollars in compensation for wrongful termination and emotional distress. Nadine, our general counsel, briefed me on the impending lawsuit. She warned me that Kelsey's legal team would likely attempt to drag the process out for months, generating negative publicity and attempting to force a massive settlement. I told Nadine that we would not settle. We would fight every single allegation with the absolute truth. I spent the weekend gathering additional evidence. I compiled a massive dossier of Kelsey's reckless financial decisions, her communications regarding my termination, and the sworn statements from the human resources staff, confirming her attempt to backdate official documents. I also secured a written statement from Elias's primary physician, confirming that while the founder's health was failing, his legal directives regarding the trust were clear, consistent, and completely voluntary. We were not merely preparing a defense, we were building a fortress. I knew that Kelsey's arrogance would ultimately be her downfall in the courtroom, just as it had been in the boardroom. She was about to learn that a legal contract is not merely a suggestion, and a foundational charter is not a document you can simply ignore when it becomes inconvenient. The legal showdown arrived several weeks later in a private arbitration room located downtown. The atmosphere was completely different from the chaotic corporate boardroom. This environment was governed by facts, evidence, and absolute precision. Kelsey arrived with her expensive legal team, wearing a defiant expression that masked an underlying desperation. She had spent the last month attempting to build a narrative of victimization, painting herself as a young, innovative leader, unfairly ousted by an entrenched, malicious corporate veteran. However, narratives crumble when they collide with documented reality. I arrived with Nadine and a single rolling briefcase containing the meticulously organized evidence we had compiled. The arbitration process was swift and entirely unsympathetic to Kelsey's emotional appeals. Her lead attorney attempted to argue that the legacy safeguard clause was an outdated relic, intended only for the initial founding period of the company. Nadine smoothly dismantled that argument by presenting the compliance audit records. She proved that the clause had been explicitly reviewed and actively reaffirmed by Elias and the board just 5 years prior. It was not a forgotten relic, it was a functioning, active component of our corporate governance. The arbitrator reviewed the notarized signatures, the timestamps, and the undeniable sequence of events that led to my termination and the subsequent activation of the trust. When Kelsey's team attempted to argue that Elias was mentally incapacitated at the time the reversion was triggered, Nadine presented the sworn affidavit from his primary physician. The document clearly stated that Elias retained full legal competency regarding his trust matters. Furthermore, Nadine introduced the evidence of Kelsey's attempt to falsify the Human Resources timeline. The signed confession from the former director of Human Resources was devastating. Kelsey had not only violated the foundational charter, but she had actively attempted to cover her tracks through fraudulent means. Her lead attorney stopped speaking, realizing that their entire case was built on a foundation of sand. The arbitrator's decision was delivered less than 2 weeks later. It was an absolute and complete victory for our side. The transition of operational oversight was legally upheld without any modifications. Kelsey's demands for millions of dollars in severance and emotional distress compensation were entirely denied. In a final devastating blow, the arbitrator ordered Kelsey to reimburse the company for the massive legal fees incurred during the arbitration process. She was officially severed from the logistics empire her uncle had built, receiving absolutely nothing. She had gambled her entire inheritance on a power play she did not understand, and she had lost everything. Returning to the corporate headquarters that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of closure. The long, exhausting battle was finally over. I walked into the corner office and looked out the massive windows overlooking the sprawling logistics hub. The trucks were moving, the warehouses were operating efficiently, and the quiet pulse of the company was strong and steady. I had not sought this position of absolute power. For 21 years, I had been perfectly content serving as the invisible architecture supporting the organization. But when the foundation was threatened, I did what was necessary to protect it. I had preserved Elias's legacy and secured the livelihoods of thousands of dedicated employees. A few days later, I visited Elias at the specialized medical facility where he was receiving care. His condition had deteriorated significantly, and he spent most of his days resting quietly in a sunlit room. I sat beside his bed and gave him a brief update on the state of the company. I told him that the logistics network was fully stabilized, the new vendor contracts had been nullified, and the veteran staff were guiding the operations with their usual expertise. I did not mention Kelsey, the arbitration, or the bitter legal battle. I simply wanted him to know that the empire he had built from a single leased delivery truck was secure. Elias listened quietly, his eyes focused on the window. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. His gaze was momentarily sharp and completely clear. He offered a small, tired smile and nodded once, a gesture of profound gratitude and unspoken understanding. He knew exactly what had transpired, and he knew that he had placed his ultimate trust in the right person. I left the facility feeling a deep sense of peace. The storm had truly passed. The corporate hierarchy was no longer vulnerable to the arrogant whims of inexperienced heirs. The foundation was rock solid. In the months that followed, I implemented a series of structural reforms to ensure that such a crisis could never happen again. I decentralized the executive authority, establishing a senior advisory committee composed of veteran logistics experts. I reinforced the compliance protocols, ensuring that no single individual could bypass the rigorous risk assessment procedures. And most importantly, I codified the principles of operational integrity into the company's core values. We were a logistics company. Our success relied on precision, accountability, and a profound respect for the process. We did not need disruptive visions, we needed reliable execution. The lessons learned during that brief, chaotic period became the new bedrock of our corporate identity. The final lesson had been taught, and the true legacy of the company had been permanently secured.